going to let John introduce our next speaker, but I do just want to say, I don't know if you all are aware, you might have seen sort of some of the leftover from the celebration last week, but this is actually the bicentennial. This year is the bicentennial of Harvard Law School. So there's been a lot of celebrating going on. That's obviously quite remarkable to have a law school for our country. I know for you guys that might not sound like so long. For us, a law school that's 200 years old is very, very old, and I'm sure you're all aware of sort of the place of this institution in our country's intellectual life. But if you had to talk about some of the people who had the most influence on this incredible institution, I think you would be hard-pressed to come up with a list that didn't include our next speaker. As a founder of the critical legal studies movement and just the role that he's played in the intellectual life of this institution has really been quite remarkable. So we are incredibly grateful to have him with us, and I hope you will all engage and have a really interesting conversation. And I'll turn it over to John to just give a little bit more.
Thank you very much, Sharon. Yeah, and thanks again for being so prompt. The labour movement is not known for its punctuality and promptness, so I'm especially pleased. Roberto Unger, as Sharon hinted, actually is one of the world's foremost social and political theorists. He's written some enormously influential books, not just about law. He is a professor of law here at Harvard, and really one of the instigators of the critical legal studies approach. But he writes much more broadly about social political issues. When he's not writing large numbers of very lengthy books, he's also actually has a long record of political activity. He was one of the key players in the transition back to democracy in Brazil in the 1980s. He served in the Lula administration, the second administration, I think, under Luiz Lula, the Workers' Party president, and I think also served in the follow-up, the Dilma administration as well. So he's one of those, I think, very rare academics who combines high intellectual activity with a lot of political activity as well. People often do one or the other. It's very rare people do both. So we're really pleased to have Roberto with us. He'll talk for about 30 to 40 minutes. I'll be stern and strict on the chairing. And then we'll have Q&A afterwards, if that's all right. I mean, sometimes speakers take questions as they go. Others prefer afterwards. Roberto said he'll make the argument first, then questions afterwards. And he's going to talk on the intriguing title of What Should the Labour Movement Propose to the Country? So I look forward to hearing. Roberto, thank you very much for coming, and over to you.
So I hope they won't be just questions and that we'll have an open conversation.
Yeah, we like to be argumentative. So.
In response to my very general remarks. My theme is the content of a progressive alternative in relation to the labor movement worldwide. And my thesis in these remarks is that there is an alternative worth fighting for, and that the labor movement can and should play a role in formulating it and advancing it. I begin with 2 points of departure. The first point of departure is the observation that the progressives, by which I mean the left and center-left forces around the world, now generally have no project. It is only slightly an exaggeration to say that the project of the progressives is the project of their conservative adversaries with a humanizing discount. They appear on the stage of contemporary history as the humanizers of the inevitable. Now in the North Atlantic world, on both sides of the Atlantic, the dominant program of the governing elites for some time has been an attempt to reconcile European-style social protection with American-style economic flexibility. Within the boundaries of a barely adjusted version of the inherited and established institutional arrangements. In this circumstance, the progressives have on the whole not had any vision of the supply side of the economy or its transformation. Their focus has been almost entirely the demand side of the economy. After they lost faith in Marxism and Marxist theory, they took refuge in vulgar Keynesianism and used it as the intellectual basis for this exclusive focus on consumption and demand rather than production and supply. My second point of departure is the idea that the task of developing a progressive alternative should not be subcontracted to the political parties. The political parties are not today a sufficient basis for the formulation of an alternative. They have become, on the whole, in every major country of the world, part of the problem. The vacuum of ideas to which I referred is manifest in the disorientation of the political parties. The task of developing an alternative falls as well on all the major movements of civil society, including the labor movement. Now, of course, there is a threshold objection of practicality to the idea that the labor movement should be a co-author of a progressive alternative for society. Some might think that practicality requires that it focus solely on the narrow work of defending the interests of its constituents. There are two responses to this argument of practicality. The first response is that the evolution of the labor movement has demonstrated that this pragmatism of theirs is in fact an anti-pragmatic pragmatism. All over the world, the labor movement is shrinking. It is a small part of the labor force in the private economy, and it sustains its life to a considerable extent by its reliance on employment by the state. As a result, it is increasingly seen and increasingly comes to see itself not as the bearer of the universal interest of society, but as just one more sectional interest, in effect a lobby. There is no prospect of reversing this situation unless the labor movement associates itself with a comprehensive project for society, not simply a project for itself. Now, the second response to the objection of practicality is that the fate of labor and its relation to capital is shaped by the institutional arrangements of society. One of the most persistent dogmas of economics is that the returns to labor, the real wage, cannot rise sustainably above the rise of productivity. We know that this dogma must be false because if we compare countries historically and control for different factor endowments, such as population or natural resources, we discover that there are striking disparities in the division of national income between labor and capital. These disparities can be understood only as being the consequence of the different institutional arrangements of the economy and of the state. The anti-pragmatic pragmatism lets the labor movement sink slowly. But the sinking is not apparent because it happens slowly. It happens in historical time. And the agents, the leaders, the representatives of the movement live in biographical time. And it happens in the circumstance that I have described of a vacuum of ideas. Now I want to come to 4 elements of such a progressive alternative, the alternative that is missing. It's not a comprehensive description. It's a focus on 4 important fragments of the missing comprehensive agenda. The first such fragment has to do with the hierarchical segmentation of the economy between advanced and backward practices of production. Until recently in the world, the most advanced practice of production was what we call Fordist mass production. The production of standardized goods and services with relatively rigid machines and production processes on the basis of semi-skilled labor and very hierarchical and specialized relations of production. Now we have in all the major economies of the world another advanced practice of production, which is sometimes called the knowledge economy. It is commonly associated with the high technology industry, but in fact, it has no exclusive connection with any particular sector of the economy. It can, in principle, develop in any part of the economy. Its characteristic is the transformation of production into a practice of permanent innovation and radical experimentalism. It combines the destandardization of goods and services with production at large scale and decentralization of initiative with the maintenance of coordination in the production plant. It holds the promise of loosening or even reversing the constraint of diminishing returns. It makes the best firms more closely resemble the best schools and changes the relation between the worker and the machine. And it signals in the direction of a radical change in the moral culture of production. To be deepened and disseminated, it would require a heightening of the level of trust and of discretion allowed and permitted to each participant in the process of production. Now, what happens is that this revolutionary practice of production, the knowledge economy, rather than being disseminated widely in the economy, remains quarantined within narrow parts of the production system. It appears as a fringe, not just in advanced manufacturing, but also in knowledge-intensive services and even in precision scientific agriculture. It is a set of fringes from which the vast majority of the labor force remains excluded. The vast majority of the labor force is consigned to the backward parts of the economy, to the rear guard, to labor that is relatively less productive. In the declining mass production industries and in isolated, traditional, retrograde small business. This situation is a machine for making economic stagnation and economic inequality. The most important cause of economic stagnation in the advanced societies today is the confinement of the most advanced practice of production, the most productive practice, to narrow parts of economic life. And at the same time, this chasm between the vanguards and the rearguards of the economy becomes a source of tremendous inequalities. That the traditional devices for the moderation of inequality, compensatory redistribution by tax and transfer, or the defense of small business against big business, are incapable of overriding. So the project, the first element of a progressive alternative, would be to establish the knowledge economy in a socially inclusive form, to radicalize it, to disseminate it throughout economic life as the only way to make labor over time more productive. That is not, on the whole, the project of the left and center-left parties in the world. To the extent that they have any view of the supply side of the economy, what they generally do is play for time, defending the declining mass production industries against the new form of production or against globalization. And this is a hopeless cause. How could we have the knowledge economy in an inclusive form? We would need to innovate in the institutional arrangements of the market economy. For example, to establish between the government and small and medium-sized firms an intermediate level of organizations designed to support the dissemination of the advanced practice of production. A form of strategic coordination between governments and firms that would be pluralistic, decentralized, participatory, and experimental. In the end, the idea is that the market order is not there on a take-it-or-leave-it basis. We don't have to choose simply between more market and less market. We can have a different kind of market. Innovating in the arrangements that define what a market economy is. Radically to democratize the market economy, to transform it into an instrument of restless experimentation as the setting for this inclusive form of the knowledge economy. Now that brings me to the second theme in a progressive alternative. The second theme has to do directly with the relation between capital and labor. The historical basis of the labor movement in the world was Fordist mass production. The assembly of a stable labor force in large productive units, factories and offices under the aegis of big businesses. But this form of production actually only prevailed in the world in a relatively brief period between the middle of the 19th century and the middle of the 20th. It was preceded by several centuries in which work was organized on the basis of decentralized contractual arrangements, like the putting out system that Marx describes in the early chapters of Capital. And now, a new putting out system is emerging in the world on a global basis. Increasing number of workers are confined to precarious employment, temporary or zero-hour contracts, and the employer of last resort of Fordist mass production, the big productive unit, disappears. If the labor movement survives in the form of public employment, It's because the state remains the thing that most closely resembles the Fordist mass production factory in its organization and in its scale. Now, it is impossible to have a democratized market economy that disseminates the knowledge economy, the most advanced practice of production, unless we maintain an upward tilt to the returns to labor. If we bet on cheap and precarious labor, we cannot hope to advance in this direction. So then the progressives must have a project for the defense of labor in this new circumstance. And this project must not simply attempt to prolong the life of the old practice of production. It must develop a body of rules and of laws that can master the new realities of production. Not allowing flexibility to be confused with precariousness. Let me give you 3 examples of the content of such rules. First, the basic economic and social guarantees of the individual worker and citizen would have to be universal or portable, not dependent on any particular job. Second, there would have to be a kind of sliding scale in the relation between direct intervention in the employment relation to protect the precarious worker and the effort to organize and represent the precarious workers. The more they are organized and represented, the less they need to be directly protected by the law. But the less they are organized and represented, the greater the need for direct legal intervention in the employment relation. And that then brings me to the 3rd example of a rule, which is the idea of the price neutrality of labor. Temporary labor, subcontracted labor would have to be paid always at least the same amount as the analogous labor undertaken under conditions of stable employment. Now I come to the 3rd theme in a progressive alternative. The 3rd theme is education. What kind of education does such an alternative require? First, it must be a form of education that accords priority to analytic and synthetic capabilities over content. The capabilities of the imagination. Second, with respect to content, it must prefer selective depth to encyclopedic coverage and superficiality. Third, it must organize all teaching and learning cooperatively by groups of teachers and students. And fourth, it must be dialectical in its approach to the received body of knowledge. Every subject must be taught at least twice from contrasting points of view. The only way to liberate the mind. It is the opposite of what generally happens in the world. What generally happens is that the national curriculums are infantilizations of the orthodoxies of the university culture. For example, in the university, economics is not the study of the economy. Economics is the study of a method pioneered by the marginalist theoreticians at the end of the 19th century. And the young are induced to confuse the dominant ideas with the way things are. And then intellectually emasculated at the beginning of their schooling and delivered to the higher stages of education, prepared for a life of intellectual servility. The educational alternative that I had described is designed to immunize them against this frustration, and it's the basis for a society that is seethed with innovative energy. Now I come to the fourth theme in the progressive alternative. And the fourth theme is the solution to a problem. The fourth theme is the organization of experimentalism. The problem is this: like the socialists and liberals of the 19th century, we recognize the primacy of structural alternatives. There is no solution to the fundamental problems of the contemporary societies without innovation in their economic and political institutions. The institutionally conservative social democrats, who have been in the ascendant in the advanced Western world since the Second World War, accept the institutional arrangements and then attempt to make them marginally more humane and more efficient. It's a humanizing and rationalizing operation. But no important problem of a contemporary society can be resolved without innovating in the structure. And an example is the problem of the hierarchical segmentation of the economy, its division between advanced and backward sectors. So we recognize that these structural changes have priority over all other changes. But unlike the liberals and socialists of the 19th century, we can no longer believe in definitive institutional blueprints, in dogmas. Right? The liberals had one solution, the socialists had another. We have to find the way along the way. We have to create structural alternatives without succumbing to structural dogmatism. How are we to do it? Now we have to do it at many different levels. By the organization of a high energy democracy with a high level of popular participation in public life and rapid resolution of impasse, the acceleration of politics. By the engagement of organized civil society outside the state and together with the state in the provision of public services, not for profit. And by the combination that we would establish between strong central initiative by the national government and radical devolution. There is no contradiction, even in a unitary state such as Britain, between strong central initiative and radical devolution. We can have more of both. The national government can decide a path for the country and persist in it so long as it has the support of the majority. But we can create arrangements that let parts of the country secede from the general solutions and create counter models of the national future. These are all examples of the organization of experimentalism. And the point of experimentalism is to find a way to produce the structural alternatives without surrendering to the structural dogmatism. Now, I've just outlined the elements of a progressive alternative, and I want, in conclusion, to suggest the value or the ambition that unifies its several parts. The value is the enhancement of agency, of the capacity to act, and to act in one circumstance and against one circumstance. The value is not simply equality. Equality is a subsidiary objective. The value is power, empowerment, in the form of a shared bigness, rather than the restriction of a large life to a minority whose power is the counterpart of the disempowerment of the others. That's the central ideal, and that's what makes it realistic. Because in any real politics, the force that most credibly embodies the cause of energy, of creation, of construction, of innovation, commands the agenda of the future. The basis of the ideal of agency is the good of vitality. Vitality is the supreme good. Life, more life, larger, bigger, over a larger scope. But vitality in itself is blind. Vitality requires an ally. The ally of vitality is the imagination, especially the institutional imagination. Let's hope there will be plenty of it. And now we can have a discussion.
Thank you very much. Roberto, thank you very much indeed for that succinct, coherent and sweeping vision. Colleagues, we have plenty of time for both contributions and questions, so fire away. You like what you heard?
Just run through it again. Nothing with aviation.
Thanks for that, that was really interesting. I liked what you had to say there about education and the role of education in delivering a progressive alternative. I don't know if you know about how the curriculum in Scotland is developing at the moment, but there's a really quite progressive curriculum that's now into its 10th or 11th year. And there's quite a bit of conflict within the system around it. Not all teachers are on board. It's about basically trying to encourage kids to think critically, to look at a series of arguments, to look at evidence, and to steer away from what was a kind of 19th century model of education that was around rote learning, drilling in literacy, numeracy, and so on. So while there are some of us within the profession whose imagination is captured by that offer, and who are instinctively committed to it, there are a significant number of our members, in fact, who remain to be convinced of it, and the wider public remains to be convinced of it as well, because it is a significant deviation from what their experience of education was, which was very much aligned to that 19th century model of it. But it's very interesting to hear you say about the potential for an education system like that to be part of this bigger alternative, progressive alternative. And there's quite a lot of international support for the curriculum that's developing in Scotland. Finland's got one of the highest performing education systems in the world, but it's one of the most equitable, and some of their leading researchers.
One of the most
equitable in terms of its outcomes. There's less of a difference in outcomes between richer and poorer kids in Finland than in some of the other countries internationally. They perform very well in both those regards. So they've looked at the Scottish Government has put together an international council of education advisors, and one of the advisors on that council is Pasi Selberg. You've probably heard of him, and he has said that a lot of what is happening just now in Scottish education is very promising in terms of what it might deliver in terms of reducing educational inequality, but there are other things that the Scottish Government are doing that potentially seek to, or potentially might undermine the power of the curriculum just now to achieve some of those outcomes. So if I suppose the ambition of the curriculum in Scotland is realised, then there's potential for Scotland to maybe deliver on some of the ambitions that you were talking about there. But given that a significant number of teachers don't really know why we're pursuing the curriculum that we aren't convinced by it, many parents aren't convinced by it, there's a big job of work for us as an education union to do in convincing and changing minds around that.
So first, let's be clear about what is radical educational innovation. So I would argue that Finland, which is widely admired, is not an example of radical educational innovation. if you study the Finnish experience, you see that they have achieved their results largely by using two instruments. One has been to remunerate their teachers very well and turn teaching into a very prestigious profession, attracting a large part of talented youth. But the second thing they've done is that in each class, they have focused huge resources in their small country on the bottom 20% of the students and given them what is in fact individualized instruction. So this has lifted their scores in the comparative tests and created the impression of a great achievement. But in no sense is it an example of the kind of transformation that I described. Now, for that transformation to occur, two practical requirements are needed of very different orders. The first requirement is that there be in the country a pedagogic vanguard, by which I mean a movement of hundreds or thousands of teachers who see themselves as the co-authors of this agenda. It is impossible to bring about an educational change of this kind simply as a conspiracy of a tiny clique of politicians, educational prophets, and bureaucrats, if they don't have below them this cadre of people who have appropriated the task, made it their own, and begun to redevelop it. Now, the second requirement is the objective, step-by-step transformation of the economy in the direction that I described. Because under traditional mass production and the other forms of now relatively regressive economic activity, the truth is the worker doesn't need to be very educated. What education does a worker in a mass production factory require? It requires elementary literacy and numeracy first. Second, a disposition to obey, conformity. And third, physical dexterity, especially hand-eye coordination. That's all they need. So they pay lip service to education, but they don't really need education, and they don't want too much education, because education produces restlessness and is incompatible with conformity. This other economic direction that I described really does need education. And if we take this direction of the inclusive form of the knowledge economy, the educational revolution is no longer a necessity, it's an imperative.
Can I ask a question about political parties? I mean, part of what you're saying is that the traditional left has lost, if you like, a sense of narrative, a clear project. Its project is mainly about reforming, carrying out mild reform to a variety of institutions. It doesn't have any overarching ambition or vision, as I understand the arguments. But you also said that political parties themselves cannot actually be the agents of any significant change. They can't be the bearers of this new
A
kind of
sufficient
project.
agent in this circumstance.
Oh, so they will play some role. Because what I wanted to ask you about is what is the role of unions, civil society organizations, the kind of movements required to generate and win support for this alternative vision? What is their role in relation to political parties? Where do political parties fit in this schema?
So first on the circumstance of the left. So one way of characterizing it in very simple terms is to say they have lost faith in the adequacy of state control of the economy. They don't believe in it, they don't think it's feasible or effective. But on the other hand, they understand that social democratic compensatory redistribution is not enough to achieve the historical objectives of the left. So one thing they don't believe in, and the other thing they regard as insufficient. But so what are they to do? Then they become these humanizers of the program of their conservative adversaries. The only antidote to that is to begin to develop a structural program, like the one that I outlined. Now, then comes the question which you raised, who should be the agent of that structural program? And the basic answer is anyone who's willing and able to do it. And so the premise of Western politics has been that's the job of the political parties. But in the situation of political prostration and intellectual vacuity that I described, the political parties are more part of the problem than part of the solution. It's in that circumstance, which is the emergency of a discontinuity, of a disorientation, that the movements of civil society must ad hoc usurp some of the role of the political parties. Now, we hope that the consequence of such a usurpation would in turn be to shake up the political parties and that they would come to life again under the provocation of this intervention from the outside.
As with Corbyn's Labour Party in Britain,
I was
perhaps.
going to say it because, sorry.
Go on, absolutely.
But I mean, do you? I don't know how sort of closely following British politics, but there does seem to have been a sort of a mini sort of manifestation of what sorts of things you're talking about over the last 12 months or so. But I mean, there's certainly some elements of what you're talking about, you know, that have been put forward through political parties, sure, but I would say by a kind of a movement which began sort of almost outside the political parties, but sort of latched onto the political parties as a vehicle for.
It's not new. It's still the same redistributive.
The problem is the content.
Yeah, the content is not new.
So the method,
It's
the
nowhere near as-
procedure is there, but the adequate substance is missing. And you can't rely on the political parties to provide it. Everyone is at the mercy of the ideas that are available to them. And the tendency of the politicians is to think that their only problem are the practical interests that are impeding the progress of their agendas. They think they have no problem about ideas. They think that ideas are easy to get, and when they need the ideas, they'll have them. The truth is just the opposite. Their greatest problem is that they don't have the ideas. And it's very hard to have ideas and to enlarge the repertory of conceptions of the organization of society. And that explains why the common situation of the progressives is to pretend to be concealing for tactical reasons a plan that in fact they don't have. And this is what we find all over the world.
Could I ask about squaring a circle that what seems to me to be an issue? So for many of us sitting around this table, the plan that you set out, the 4-point plan, for many of us, we all come from labour organisations that rely upon a membership fee to ensure that we exist as organisations. In part, many of us sitting around the table have a vested interest, or our members have a vested interest, in protecting the status quo of the jobs that are what you would describe as a backward productive system. So if we're to play a part in creating this new agenda, this new programme, we run the risk of alienating the people who actually pay for and create and are the organisations which you are asking to empower to deliver.
Absolutely.
How do we square that circle?
Well, so let me sharpen the dilemma that you present. It's a dilemma experienced by labor leaders all over the world. In debates like this one we're having here, they say, you're asking me to put at risk my relation, my historical relation to my core constituency before I have another constituency. So I'll lose this one before I have the other one. I'll be left with nothing. And then comes the point that they don't live in historical time. So the project of labor worldwide might be slowly sinking down into the swamp. But by the time it's totally sunk, they'll be dead. And so it's not their problem. Well, this is a problem that we have in a transformative practice anywhere. And it requires audacity and vision to see that this project has no future. It is predicated, as you implied, on a division between insiders and outsiders, a minority of relatively stable workers who are the constituents, and a majority of precarious, disorganized workers who are the majority. And the fate of the labor movement depends on what happens to that majority and in what paradigm of production, in what form of economic life. So and this isn't just a problem of labor, this is then what happens also in politics. So what is the economic policy of the Social Democrats? It's to get a few more years for mass production. And what do the right-wing populists propose? More or less the same thing. So this is the circumstance that we find ourselves in. And the leader who is a visionary, who is willing to risk, must see and say, this has no future. We must make another bet. We must work with other forces in society to develop an alternative. Now, that leads me to a practical observation about class alliances. So the traditional working class, as it's been defined, excludes the small business class, the petty bourgeoisie. The small business class is huge, and on some measures, it's larger than the industrial proletariat of the Marxists. And if you define it in subjective rather than objective terms, the horizon of aspiration to a modicum of prosperity and independence, it's the majority of the society. What happened in European history is that the left elected the small business class as its enemy. And it then became the mainstay of the right-wing movement. This was part of the calamity of European history. So any transformative project now depends on the development of a class alliance that cuts across these divisions and that has a proposal not just for the workers in large productive units, but for the precarious self-employed and the small business class. That's the direction of this economic alternative. And it has to be seen as a large project, but it has to be translated also into a series of short-term initiatives that represent, as it were, down payments on this alternative future.
Yeah, just in the back, yeah, on Sharon and Carl.
So thank you, this is really interesting. I'm not sure I completely agree with your analysis of social democracies. The way that I see it, the last couple of decades, or maybe even 3 decades, they've actually been focused a lot on educational reforms and rather giving up on the demand side and focusing on the supply side quite heavily. Social investment state would be the sort of big claim of a lot of European social democracies. You can argue that hasn't really been very effective, but that is at least what they've been trying to portray themselves at. So then I'm wondering if you can point to any examples or countries that have been successful, or where do we look basically for good examples of the kinds of ideas that you're saying? Because for me, some social democratic parties have been trying to do these things, but have been alienating actually the working class while doing it. And Corbyn, for example, would be the response to that, like saying we need to get rid of.
For example, what are you thinking of as trying to do this?
Well, I mean, trying to level the playing field in terms of equal opportunity through education. So the Scandinavian social democratic parties would be the best example of that.
So I agree with you to this extent that the greatest historical achievement of European social democracy has been a high level of investment in people and in their capabilities. delivered through public services. And that's not just recently, that was the abiding theme of European social democracy. But at a tremendous price. The price was retreat from the attempt to innovate in the forms of economic and political organization. So that's the essence of the social democratic bargain. The essence was the forces that challenge the established organization of production and power relinquish their challenge, and in return, the state is allowed to acquire the power to regulate the economy intensively, to redistribute retrospectively by progressive taxation and redistributive social spending, and to manage the economy countercyclically through fiscal and monetary policy. That's social democracy. So the claim that I'm making is that no fundamental problem of a contemporary society can be adequately solved or even addressed within the terms of this social democratic compromise. So then the question is whether what the Nordic countries are doing counts as a reopening of the social democratic project. I don't think so. I think what they're doing is they're attempting to lighten social democracy up, to flexibilize it, as in the example of the German labor law reforms. And their most characteristic theme is the theme of labor market flexibility. But they allow the confusion of the flexibilizing of labor with the cheapening of labor to persist. They don't do what I proposed in my second fragmentary theme, develop a new body of rules to protect, organize, and represent the new majority of precarious employees. So it's what has happened to social democracy is that it has retreated to the last line of defense. And the last line of defense is the maintenance of a high level of social spending, investment in people, paradoxically financed by the regressive taxation of consumption through instruments like the VAT. So it's a kind of hollowed out social democracy, a social democracy in retreat, on the defensive. It has no affirmative program for the future, for the redirection of economic life. That's what political power is. That's what I said at the end. If you want to control the agenda of the future, you can't be the humanizer of the program of your adversary. You have to be the one who sets the agenda. You have to represent the cause of energy and innovation. That's what they haven't done.
I mean, just sort of comment you made at the end about the difference between a socialist and a kind of a liberal approach, and there has to be another kind of program and approach. I mean, I sensed within your talk that there was an implicit, you may have thought it was an explicit criticism of unions, in that our kind of outlook and approach to the organisation of work and indeed of society is, in some parts, is wholly conservative with a small c, is at times atavistic, and for two reasons. One, because the way things were makes it easier for us to organise, that Fordist model, because your analysis is spot on in terms of unionisation in the UK is kept afloat, as it is in the United States, by public sector, the remnants of a Fordist organisational model. So we're attached to that because it makes it easier to organise. We're attached to it because of the prevailing political bias within the trade union movements, which, despite us practicing a more pragmatic approach, still remains state socialist. I mean, you can go around offices of the British trade union movement and see busts of Lenin and Stalin and East German flags and various other
I don't think you've been in
regalia,
my office, have you?
That's what he's talking about.
and Mao Zedong and all of that stuff. You can still see that in the British trade union movement. So there's clearly a longing for that kind of approach, or a what I think sometimes is a bit of a juvenile affectation of it. So in terms of all of that, what is your view about the structure? Are unions broken in the current form and really need to just sort of dissemble and reform
Well,
in alliances with other groups in society?
Well, I look at the reality, and just to simplify, but not too much, in these societies, you have a situation in which the unions have two bases. One basis is the residue of mass production industry. And that then leads to the project of defending it. A few more years. They know it's gonna die, but they'll get a little more afterlife from it. And then the second basis is the state as the residual employer, because the state is the entity, the surviving entity that looks most like the form of production that disappeared or is disappearing. Well, and so then the project is defend a high level of taxation for the public services that pay these public employees and so forth. The result of this is, as I said at the beginning of my remarks, that the union movement begins to be seen as just a lobby. It's just a corporate interest defending a minority, and it comes to see itself that way. So my perspective is the perspective of someone who's interested in the transformation of the whole. So if the unions are going to continue to act this way, they're not part of the solution. They too are part of the problem, like the political parties. And what we need to find is at what points can there be a bridge between this circumstance in which each organization condemns itself to be just a special interest to the reaffirmation of a general project for the society. And then the question of the content, the actual substance of the ideas becomes decisive.
Sharon, Gary, and then Mel. We'll take a couple of questions together, I think, because they're starting to roll now.
So I'm sort of pathologically practical, so my mind is going to like what are the things that those of us who care and are in this space can do to actually start helping make a transformation. And it seems to me the sort of problem that we were just talking about has a potential solution, the sort of investment of even the remnants or whatever of the current progressive infrastructure being entrenched and committed to the status quo. It seems to me we actually probably have a generation of young workers now who we're so close to the end that you can make the pitch to them that actually you can break that entrenchment because this system may very well die on your watch. So getting around the problem that you suggested, that current leaders
Historical and biographical
right,
time.
that it is actually in their biographical time. So is a first step to think about leaders and ways to begin to mobilize. Yeah, I mean, I hate to sound ageist because I don't think anybody would put me in the category of like young workers, but is that where, if you were thinking about a first step, is that a first step to focus there? And is anybody taking those first steps? Are there examples that you can point us to?
Well, I think so one can think of initiatives procedurally and substantively. So procedurally, in the method of action, the unions could begin to experiment with forms of joint action with the representatives of other interests. And there are two crucial groups. One group is the precarious workers, the involuntary self-employed, and do take initiatives together with them and develop the institutional vehicles for this joint action. And then the second group is the small business class with immense importance, both objectively and in consciousness in the society, and bring them into this form of joint action. So that's on the side of procedure and method. Then on the side of substance, to begin to develop an agenda around these themes, like the 4 themes that I described. Because each of these ideas can be translated into a series of initial steps. The initial steps always have to be designed in the particular circumstance of a particular country, not in a circumstance like this, in which I'm thinking worldwide. I'm just signaling a direction, but the direction has to be translated into these first moves. There's no reason why it can't be, because each of these things that I've explored here has counterparts in initiatives that one could take right now with the instruments that are already at hand.
A couple of observations. I'm not really sure where this goes. But in terms of a problem in a general union like mine, is the danger is you end up with political activists and a political wing, which passes policy which is to the detriment of the industrial wing who pays for the political wing. So we end up with tensions around political activists want to do away with industries that actually, in which there are jobs, in which there is a future, to replace it with industries where there are no jobs. And we talk in the most abstract terms about industries where we diversify, and it's all absolutely meaningless nonsense for the people who are expected to pay for the political wing of the union.
So you're thinking about the nuclear industry, for example.
The renewables industry in the UK.
I understand.
All of our jobs in the renewables industry are in Denmark or Germany, or in China. We just pay for it. The poorest in UK society pay for a foreign-owned, foreign-built renewable sector. And I'm bored listening to people saying, well, it shouldn't be that way. Well, it shouldn't, but we're charged with dealing with the hard, practical realities of looking after gas workers and nuclear workers on a day-to-day basis. The second big challenge, as I see it, is one about our credibility as trade unions. The truth is, and my thesis has been on this course, that the biggest problem confronting trade unions in the UK, and with some very honourable exceptions, but we just aren't very good at doing our basics around our job. I've got a picture of Eleanor Marx on my wall. It's not Stalin. Who was on about? Stalin and me. You know, you're hanging out with Unite too often. Or Richard and Prospect, but you know, I've got a picture of Marx on my wall, and Eleanor Marx. And the point I always say to every young official that I employ is that woman gave us our commitment to equalities as a union, which is important. We've not always lived up to it, but it's important. And she also gave us her politics. But the point being, the thing that differentiates Marx and the other founders of our union from trade union leaders today is that they realised you earn the right to talk to working class people about politics, and we don't earn that right enough consistently now within the UK. So where we end up is we don't do our job properly, and then we tell our members to vote Labour. Trade union members are voting Conservative. In Scotland, we tell our members the only time they hear from us is when we tell them to vote Labour. The members are voting for the Nationalists. And with the exception of Scotland, we tell our members to vote to stay in Europe. And we have a huge campaign, and by the way, we've done a deal with the Tories along with everybody else in the TUC. We've done a deal with the Tories over the pro-Brexit campaign. And where we end up is our members, or large parts of them, are voting for Brexit because we have no credibility, we have no money in the bank in terms of talking about politics to our membership. So I think there is, I disagree with you on some things, we've not got enough time to go through all that, but
Thank God. It'll remain a mystery.
I could be here all day, but it's intriguing, it provokes an interesting debate. But the fundamental difficulty we have in large parts of the UK labour movement, not at all, is we do not have the bloody credibility to talk to our members about politics, never mind about talking about a vision of a new society.
But what's the conclusion that you draw from your own story?
Well, the job I'm on, and I'm tasked with heading up my operation for my union in Scotland, is restoring our credibility and doing the basics right. Half the public sector is not in a union. Large chunks of the private sector who are covered by collective bargaining are not in a union. It's not that the workers in those industries want me to envisage some new form of society and organisation for them, intriguing as though that is. They just want us to get the coffee machines fixed, get the safety fixed, do something about their pay and occasionally send them a communication.
So when will you start on the new agenda then? When will you decide that you've
Yeah,
got the basics right?
Yes.
No, but like Andrew, we're on a journey. We've had 20 years of decline and frankly, excuse the language, being shit. You ain't going to turn that around in a day. But our union in Scotland is growing, and we'll grow quite significantly this year, and we'll be the only part of the Scottish trade union movement, I would hazard a guess, that will grow maybe outside the prospect. And we're growing, sorry Mel, but we're growing on the basis of doing fundamental things.
Can I just, because I think that what I wanted to say actually, I think relates to, but also differs from the points that you've made actually, because I found it really interesting, because I think that, you know, part of the reason that we're here is that as trade unions, the labour movement, we are in decline, and we've been in decline for, you know, several decades, and we keep, you know, looking at and asking ourselves this question as to, you know, what we can do. And I've been kind of thinking about the fact that even though we've adopted all these different approaches to organising, etc., that actually it's not changing. You know, what we're doing is not working. So the question is actually, you know, and I often sit there and contemplate, you know, about what that is and why it is. So for me, actually, this is a really interesting proposition about, you know, stepping completely back and thinking it through, and that actually, you know, our project is flawed and it's not fit for purpose in the world in which we live. And that actually there is an extent, and we do have this sort of real challenge, because we are representing essentially an aristocracy of labour. And that's not just, you know, across the economy, because actually the whole issue is that in lots of parts of the economy there is no trade union recognition. So it's not that those people are not even, you know, we're not even near to getting those people into trade union membership, because there's no organisation there and we're not speaking to those people. Yeah. But also even within, so I also organise within sort of public sector employers as well. And what I see there is that we, even within those environments, we're organising an aristocracy of labour. We're organising the higher paid and the older workers. And actually our membership amongst young people is really, really low. And so we have to, you know, sort of look at that sort of, you know, and fundamentally challenge. And I think you're absolutely right that, so even looking at something like Corbyn and the Labour Party, which I think has been really interesting, because I think it's, a lot of that came from social movements and sort of individual campaigns. There were lots of young people that started to get involved. But one of the flaws of that project is that so much of its objectives are based upon sort of a historical, you know, sort of model, if you like, of socialism, and they don't necessarily, you know, it's about sort of, you know, going back into public ownership and certain things, and there isn't a radical alternative that looks at the economy and the world that we're in, and I think that is something that we really need, you know, as a whole movement to think about in terms of, you know, sort of doing that. And I think that it is partly about how as trade unions, you know, we see ourselves, and, you know, how we sort of move ourselves away from simply just that kind of servicing of particular constituencies into becoming part of something so interesting for me.
So I think it's crucial to distinguish different questions, different levels of thinking. So one set of questions is it important, is it useful to defend the interests of workers who are stuck in these declining mass production industries, and defend the interests of the employees of the state? And is it not true that there are better and worse ways of doing that work? The answer to all of those questions is, of course, yes. That is an entirely legitimate form of work. Now we come to the second question. Does that work of defending the interests of those two groups hold promise as an avenue to the transformation of society in a progressive direction? The answer to that question is unequivocally no. So right there's a problem. The problem is that the labor movement historically didn't think of itself as just some kind of concierge for the problems of workers. It thought of itself as the bearer of a universal project of social transformation. Now we come to a third question. And the third question may break the tie between these two questions. Because after all, the person who's defending the interests of his constituents can say, it's not my responsibility to transform society. That's a historical project beyond my reach. But we have this intermediate question, the third question. Does the defense of those narrow interests, without any programmatic horizon, offer promise of defending the interests of the working class majority of the society? It's not just the general project of social transformation, it's the defense of the working class as a whole in its majority. And the answer to that question is also no. That's not an avenue to the organization and the defense of the majority of working people. And so that is a fatal objection to this path. If it's considered strategically. It's not a strategy at all, it's a holding operation. And of course one can do it better or worse and one can be tactical about it, but it has no larger significance, it has no promise for the future. It's a lost cause. That's the claim that I'm making. And therefore, at a minimum, it's necessary for the labor movement to develop a project that goes in the direction of representing the working class majority of the country. That's not possible without having proposals for the dissemination of the most advanced practice of production, without having proposals for the change of the rules in the relation between labor and capital, unorganized labor as well as organized labor, without having a project for education, and without having a series of experimental procedures designed to discover the path.
Carl,
I was just
an ultimate word.
I was just glad Mel sort of mentioned that, because there's two kind of substantive policy issues that I think we're probably not going to get time to do it, that you could almost have a very practical discussion of your ideas on, and that are very live issues in the British trade union movement and the British politics and in this room, in that our approach to the ownership of the railways in the UK. So the Labour Party in its manifesto pledged to renationalise the railways in the UK. The operating companies are privatised, but the network is still nationalised, state-owned. I mean, essentially what's happened is we've privatised the profit and nationalised the risk. But also in relation to education, where we've had this kind of very progressive, not in the sense that you mean it. We started off with, we used to have all our public schools were run by local authorities, by education committees, and then under a Labour government that we brought in academies, which essentially kind of stepped outside that control and ran themselves, and now we've got free schools, and there's kind of been a further fragmentation of the education system. And I think in both those cases, the general view of the unions organising in them sectors is to kind of, certainly our rail unions support nationalisation of the railways, and our education unions would, I think by and large, prefer to go back to some form of control by local authorities or some kind of local democracy. And I think they're two issues where you could have a real get down to the meat and drink of to what extent is the view of unions your view of unions becoming lobbyists and protectors of sectional interests, namely the people who work on the railways and the people who teach in classrooms, is clashing with pressure on political parties to come up with genuinely progressive, by your definition, futures for those particular public services.
Yeah, one thing that you should appreciate is that many of these dilemmas of the leadership of the union movement that we're discussing are the consequence of a very particular legal framework of union organization, which in the 20th century was not the only legal framework in the world. So in the North Atlantic world, what prevailed was the collective bargaining system, a contractual labor system in which unionization is voluntary. And then the workers who voluntarily unionize pay. And that gets us to some of these dilemmas. In Latin America, for example, you had a corporatist labor system, which exists to this day, in which everyone is unionized automatically. Unionization is a gift of the law, according to their sector in the economy. There's no question of volunteering to unionize. But then, under that corporatist system, the unions were put under the tutelage or the guidance of the state through the Ministry of Labor. So you have the contractualist system in which unionization is fragmentary and voluntary and completely independent from the state, and the corporatist system in which unionization is automatic but under the guidance of the state. What we have found historically is that the collective bargaining system produces an economistic tilt to the demands of the unions. They focus on short-term wage and benefits issues, and that the collective bargaining system tends to reinforce the hierarchical divisions of the economy. In the capital-intensive sectors of the economy, where the wage is a relatively small portion of cost, the capital and labor have coincident interests against everyone else. So you have an aggravation of the inequalities. So what would you desire then, in principle? You would desire, I would say, for the organized part of the labor force, a hybrid system in which everyone is automatically unionized, as in the corporatist regime, but the unions are completely independent from the state. And then different movements compete for place in the union structure, just as different political parties compete for place in the state. Now, I'm saying all of this because it's important not to treat these dilemmas as if they were somehow natural, as if they existed automatically. They are the product of a particular set of arrangements that produce them. And so in acting and in thinking, we have to correct for the effect of these arrangements. We have to take them into account. But if we're serious about transformation, we can't surrender to them. No. We can't treat them as if they were fate.
Okay, I think we have to draw to a close at that point. One of the links, I think, between this session and this morning is Dave was talking about leverage and organizational capacity, and also talking about the importance of strategic analyzing the environment within which unions operate, profit markets, labor markets, economy, etc. For the purpose of the exercise this morning, he was saying, well, much of those facets of the environment, the union movement itself and individual unions really can't change. We have to recognize those constraints and figure out ways of operating strategically within them. And I think one thing that Roberto has been doing this afternoon is to say, well, actually, in the long run, unless we change some significant elements of that environment, economic, political, etc., all the strategic choices we make, all the organizing campaigns, the resources we commit, doing our job better, will be operating in an increasingly adverse and difficult environment.
So I can just add a comment to that.
Oh, please do. Yes.
The world is organized to reproduce itself. So that's what the world is. So for there to be transformation, there has to be a reimagination on one side of the arrangements, the institutions and practices, and on the other side, a reinterpretation of the interests and identities of the people. They have to imagine themselves as members of another world where they would have other interests and other identities. If we don't do that, all we have is the reproduction of the world. The world goes on. All of our arguments then about strategy, tactics, constraints are just a rehearsal or reaffirmation of the power of the world to reproduce itself. Thought and politics are the enemies of the stagnant world, and they exist, transformative thought, transformative practice, to intervene, to interrupt this self-reproduction of the world.
On the optimistic notes, thank you very much. Okay, colleagues, so we have 10 minutes?
No, I think about 15
15-minute break. 15-minute break, and then we're back here for a group exercise afterwards. Thank you.